Welcome in, folks, those of you that are in live and those watching later. Hi. Welcome. Really excited about this session. These two impact reports talking about bias and the climate and environmental impact. And these are both individual standalone sessions in the last AI summit. And I was like, these are just super important topics. We want to get more publicly out there. So we are hosting them together as free sessions. And both presenters today are also collaborators in the upcoming AI for Nonprofit and Advocacy cohort. So we've got that cohort kicking off soon, and folks can register throughout the month of September and jump in the cohort before it moves too far forward. Super excited about that. And really excited to have Jim, who's a longtime friend and a doctor of robotics, doing machine learning stuff for a long time. We worked together in the Obama space. The funny note I'll share is it was only a few months ago where I realized that Jim did not pivot from mechanical robots into the engineering side. He had always been working. I knew Jim working on websites and stuff, and I was like, I know he's doing all this amazing building of tools and applications in the digital space. And it turns out the computer side of robotics, not the large mecha things. And I had been telling my kids that Jim was the guy who knew how to build big physical transformer robots. Catherine, really excited to have you in. We just connected earlier this year, and Catherine's really like out there charging as a leader in the AI space and thinking about it on both fronts. Like one, like how do we use this in really awesome practical ways to move the needle forward? And what are the ethical implications with bias and all that? And so with that, how we're going to go today, we're going to have Catherine jump in, kick off her report. We'll do some questions, then we'll do some questions throughout. So I'll keep an eye on chat to pop in some of those questions. And then we'll do Jim's report, some questions, and then some open questions as well. Catherine, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Oh, can you share? I have some slides. Do you mind?
I didn't realize you should be able to share now. Did it give you permission? Okay, great.
All good. So excited to be here. This is a topic that I'm really passionate about. This was our second biases in generative AI survey that we did this year. Just a little bit of background. I started using ChatGPT when it first came out, thought it was so amazing. Then I started seeing so many biases, and I was thinking, is nobody else noticing this? Why is it giving me, a picture of Maya Angelou that's an old white woman? And why, when I ask for community radio, it's saying, yo, fam, we're about to get some grub. And it's, that's what people are putting into the system. And so I started really thinking about how can we address this. That led to the survey. And so I'm just going to walk through some of the insights that we found and then how nonprofits can think about those biases as it's using AI in its daily work. A little bit more about myself. I and my agency, again, Catharine Montgomery. I have lived on the East Coast in various cities, born in New Orleans, grew up in Alabama, went to Atlanta, DC, Boston, DC. So I've seen a lot of the different perspectives, whether it's in the South or the North. That gives me a large perspective on biases in generative AI. I come from a large comms agency background, pivoted to startups so I could focus on social impact, obsessed with AI, but also know that there are tons of biases in generative AI. And so it made my platform to analyze and address how to use AI responsibly. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll see a lot of that conversation going on. Getting into the nuts and bolts of what we found in our second biases in generative AI study, for nonprofits, Gen A bias goes beyond technical concerns and it's really can threaten your mission. 33% of consumers will abandon biased Gen AI tools. And this is astounding, but 92% expect organizations to address Gen A bias. When using these tools, it can really eliminate trust if you're using them in the wrong way. If you're working with it to develop content or brainstorm and you have a limited view on what the content should be, then it will come out biased. And that could be content that you're using to reach your donors, write grants, to get members to join your nonprofit. It's very important that you use AI to be more efficient, but that you also are educated on what biases to notice. Recently, I was looking for an image on FemTech, and I was using Midjourney, which is an image generator. And when I put in femtech, it had a picture of an Asian woman. Very impressive, but then I reran it about 5 times, and each time it was only Asian women. The internet assumed that if you're talking about technology and women, then it has to be an Asian woman. If you're not educated around that, you would never know. You would never think, okay, this picture looks great. These are things nonprofits have to keep in mind when they're trying to relate to different audiences. You could build a checklist of X, Y, and Z when using AI. You want to make sure that you're keeping that trust and delivering from a nonprofit point of view. When your AI excludes the communities you serve, you undermine your purpose. And consumers and potential members and other companies, they're watching for that. They are watching to see if you are addressing the AI and the language you put out. We saw that some industries that have the most concern from consumers. Healthcare, we know that there was a lot of testing even before AI that excluded certain groups. We work with a women's health nurse practitioners group. Definitely use AI with them, whether it's brainstorming or, changing content, things like that. But they also are in really rural areas of America, and we really need to relate to what's happening in those areas and not just use what AI spits out, because it's likely going to be biased in some way. So we make sure that when we're using AI, we also are relating to those groups and that we have the right messaging, images, et cetera. Education, this is a tough topic because not only are students using it in the classroom, but it's the way people are teaching nowadays. You can get degrees in AI. When it comes to nonprofits and educating their members or students or whatever groups they're in, we're working with a public school system that is a nonprofit and a charter school. So just making sure what you're putting out there is actually as unbiased as possible. We're never going to get rid of all biases, but this is a concern that consumers have. And then government services, the policies that are coming out, we know that's a contentious area. When you're writing those grants, depending on government funds at whatever level of the government it is, just making sure that you're relating to everyone. And I know this is kind of stark statistics, but I do want to keep reiterating that AI is very beneficial for nonprofits. It's important to realize those areas that you need to pay attention to. Like I was mentioning, there is a lot of risk, but there's also a lot of opportunity. So when it comes to donors, you want to audit AI segmentation for demographic groups, create diverse giving pattern recognition models, and implement feedback loops from underrepresented donors. Without AI, you want to make sure that you're including as many different people as possible when you're trying to get donors and not just stick to the richest or the most popular donors to work with. AI provides another partner who can expand that reach and awareness that you might not have previously, but making sure that the demographics you're looking for, whoever you're trying to reach out to, is included in that AI output, because it can be limited to who put the data in and what it's analyzing from Reddit or Wikipedia that maybe isn't the audience you're trying to reach. And then community-led member engagement. This is a great way to get feedback on what you're putting out there. For, example, there's tons of protests now. And so if you have certain signs and language, that's real-time feedback you can get. Or if you're helping deliver food to different communities, it's a good way to have one-on-one conversations about the messaging you're delivering and if you're reaching the right people. Test your AI tools, representative user panels. You can have people in a room who's using different tools to see if it's actually unbiased. You can do this internally with your team and develop bias reporting mechanisms for members. This is a great way to get free input from volunteers and members who are paying the nonprofits to say, is this resonating with your audiences in your local location, or do we need to adapt it to your audiences? And AI is great at, you train it, you input that data. I have a co-CEO where I just put in all the articles that are in my voice so it can start to learn how we speak. And that's exactly what nonprofits can do, is just training whatever AI tool you use to make sure it sounds like your audiences and what your organization represents. And then you want to have balanced fundraising content. Diverse is the word in all of this. You want to have diverse reviewers for AI generated appeals. You want to create inclusive storytelling guidelines and then measure response rates across demographic groups, which is very important with fundraising. There's not a lot of dollars right now. They're going across so many different organizations. If you're a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and you're able to get large amounts of money, it's totally fine. They are also using AI a lot in their programming, but they have so many people to make sure the AI isn't biased. When you're scrappy and smaller, it's important to think ahead about these things. And so you can lose funding easily if you don't address those biases. And then equitable grant processes is a big differentiator. There are so many nonprofits going after grants right now, but if you're able to show how you're using AI efficiently and effectively and not relying on it to develop your grants and you're able to brainstorm with it and use it as a thought partner, that's so important. With the CEO, I'm able to, am I going in the right direction? Are there other ideas I'm not thinking about? Thinking outside of let's create content using AI, but also how can it really advance the organization? And then some more data from our study on the positive side. So 25% are more likely to support organizations addressing biases in generative AI, different from the 33% who would walk away from those organizations. There is an opportunity to show that you're using AI in the right way. That's what people want. It's where the world is going toward, and it's not going to be a stigma toward using AI. And consumers, donors, fundraisers, and your target audiences are going to think, oh yeah, you're using AI, but are you using it in the right way and trying to train your tools to be as unbiased as possible? Also, fairness ranked number 2 after accuracy when using AI. You want the correct information to come out. You don't want it to hallucinate as much as possible, but they also want it to be fair. A lot of times we're caught up in which tool is coming out the fastest, what's wrong with the tool when it comes out. But companies and nonprofits need to also be thinking about fairness and reaching those communities. And then organizations with ethical AI practices recover faster. There's so many ways that you can have situations that happen and you're not ready to respond to them. I know we've seen a lot of crises lately with for-profit companies, but it can also impact nonprofits. Do you have that statement in place beforehand? Do you know who can respond to media if something happens and you didn't put out the right messaging? Are you going to be transparent or are you going to be defensive? And so knowing all of that beforehand, because there's so many risks with using AI, but again, there's so many opportunities. And I also want you all to think about this, the competitive advantage, that scrappiness that some nonprofits have to do. You can use AI and become one that writes those grants, gets more donors, fundraises faster. And if you don't have a lot of team members, you can actually build agents or workflows, add 4 or 5 people to your team. Learning how to use it fair, being accurate in what you deliver, it can really improve your output and efficiency. I want to end with a framework you can use. It can be overwhelming using AI in general, but then adding on, I need to pay attention to biases. This 5-step framework is a commit and set vision. A lot of times we start at different levels of implementing AI into nonprofits and different organizations, but it has to start at the top. Your leadership needs to be committed to training your team, working together to learn which tool works best for you and not having one-off uses of different tools. You want to make sure that you're training the tool so that it represents the organization. Maybe use ChatGPT tools, and that's the only tool you recommend your team use. So you're aware that we're training it the right way, we're going to get the right outputs, but really just want to make sure you start at the top. There's a CEO of a nonprofit and he loves just using AI, so he'll just randomly use it, but he's not training anyone else and doesn't really know how to use it himself. That's not what you want to do, and it doesn't help with eliminating bias. Diversifying your data and your team. In general, before AI, you want to have more diverse teams. If you have there's studies, if you have women on your team, you're more likely to raise more money. You also want to do that with AI. And then step three, you want to test, audit, and repeat. It's okay to not get it right at first. You want to make sure you're testing what you output, having those groups give you feedback, and you want to audit what you're doing and then repeat that. It's a continuous process and not something you do once and think everything's fine. Is your messaging resonating with your different audiences? And then step four, you want to implement real-time filters. You can give every team member, they can put it on their desk. It can be electronic, Notion, however you want to use it. But saying, okay, you've created this information in generative AI. These are the 10 things you need to watch out for to ensure it's as bias-free as possible. And that's just a simple way implemented from the top. Step five, engage users and continuously improve. And this goes back to the opportunities that each nonprofit has, collecting that feedback from your community, and then updating your report approach. And that goes back to step three, which is your test, audit, and repeat. And you don't have to do this all immediately. It takes time. It takes a lot of education. This is just kind of how to eliminate biases in the outputs that we use with AI. I have developed an AI bias action plan for nonprofits. It goes into much more detail on each of the steps. You can scan the QR code here, but feel free to email me, put it in the chat that you're looking forward, and I'll send it to you. I'm also open to one-on-one conversations to go deeper into eliminating and addressing biases in your AI tools. That's all I got.
Do folks have any questions specifically for Catherine before we jump over to Jim? Just give it a second and see if anything pops in.
I'm going to share my LinkedIn.
Yeah, that'd be great. Jim, do you want to go ahead, and we can also do more questions at the end, but if you want to jump in with your report, that'd be great. And Catherine can hang out for some general QA at the end as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right, go ahead. Oh.
We're seeing Google News and an angry RFK.
A lot of seeing that. Can you see this slideshow now?
No.
All right, let me try that one more time. Thought I was being clever and starting the slideshow before I shared it, so we wouldn't have to go through this phase.
Now,
thanks, Brad, and thank you, Catherine. You didn't get a chance to see that during the summit, but yeah, some really great insights there, and deeply appreciative about your work on that really important issue. So I'm going to be talking about the environmental impact of generative AI. This is something that those of us in the progressive and social impact space had concerns about from the beginning of the generative AI era, once ChatGPT came out, and have identified that these models can be quite energy intensive and maybe using a lot of water. There have been some very legitimate concerns across the space. What's going on here? What does it mean for us to be, if we're using the systems, how are we contributing to harm and in what ways? Up until fairly recently, there wasn't a lot of actual data and evidence about what's specifically happening here. If I'm using ChatGPT, am I killing a tree every time I type a problem? Fortunately, in the last few months, a lot more information has come out. And so we do now have a much better sense as to what it means from an environmental perspective to use generative AI and how we can then measure the costs and benefits of those tools versus the harm they may be causing. So just briefly to start, I am Jim Pugh. I'm the CEO of a company called Share Progress. Been around for about 12 years. Specifically, I'm now leading a new initiative within a company called AI Progress Hub. Our focus is helping progressive and social impact orgs to both understand and unlock the potential of generative AI to help with their missions. So to start with, I'd love if folks could just share in the chat, what have you heard about AI's environmental impacts? I know there's a lot of stuff out there. It'd be great to know what some folks have been hearing or seeing, which hopefully it'll all be stuff that will be addressed in this presentation. But yeah, I feel it's helpful to be able to get a sense of where folks are coming from here. So I'll just pause briefly, see if folks want to drop anything in, and then please continue to drop in comments throughout the presentation, as well as questions in the Q&A feature. All right, well, in the interest of time, I am gonna keep going. Omar says mixed information, some outdated and more up to date. Yeah, not as bad. So yes, we'll be covering, I suspect, a lot of what you're seeing. Did such a bad environment, but we just need to deal with it right now. Let's know there are solutions. Right. Keep dropping stuff in there. I'll be sharing generally information here, but also can hopefully address specific things that folks have. Briefly going over the agenda for today's presentation. The things we're covering: first, myths and reality. So what are some of the common things that are out there that are not true, and what is now the information that we have available on different fronts? Talking about AI beyond ChatGPT and similar tools often is the main focus because it's the most visible aspect of AI for most people. But as we'll be seeing, it's not necessarily the most important point of focus from an environmental perspective. I do want to spend a bit of time talking about how AI actually can be beneficial on the climate front and some stuff that has been happening in that area. Finally, talking again about policy and action. It is mostly geared for people who work in a space where you're engaging with environmental advocacy, but it also, I think, is relevant for anyone to engage with at the individual level. All right, myth number one: using tools like ChatGPT results in substantial carbon emissions. I think this is probably the number one thing that comes up. People ask, if I'm using ChatGPT to run prompts like a dozen times a day, am I causing huge harm on the climate change front? Fortunately, the short answer is no, not really. For any question like that, context is key. How much emissions are you creating versus how much emissions you're creating through other things you do? Oh, and then quickly to answer, yes, happy to share the slides from this. So we'll work with Brad to figure out how to get it out there. Research in 2024 estimated that a single ChatGPT query used about 3 watt-hours of energy. That's roughly equivalent to streaming video for 2 minutes or running a space heater for 2.5 seconds. If you consider it in contrast to other things in your daily life, it's not huge unless you're running hundreds of queries a day. More recent estimates put that number quite a bit lower. Was the standard model up until a month ago, used about 0.3 watt-hours. That aligns with information put out by OpenAI. Google actually just last week released energy data on their Gemini model, which had it in the same ballpark. They said it was 0.24 watt-hours. The difference there is likely a combination of things. The models got more efficient. The earlier versions of ChatGPT, even though they were less powerful, they were actually using a lot more processing. The newer models, even though they can do a lot more, seem to be using less. The earlier analysis made some assumptions that hasn't lined up with more data that's come out around how the systems are actually running. To give a bit more context here, what does that mean if it's using somewhere between 0.3 and 3 watt-hours? Even if you use the older, larger energy number, if we're comparing this to transatlantic flights, which many of you may know is one of the largest emitters of carbon emissions, you would need to ask ChatGPT for 3.5 million questions to match one single transatlantic flight. So for me, that says more about the flight than it does about ChatGPT, but just to kind of give you a contrasting point here, something maybe a little closer to normal daily flow. If you watch 1 hour of Netflix, that's equivalent somewhere between 300 and 3,000. But a key thing here to note, this is all comparing to ChatGPT's fast model, GPT-4o. They also, those of you who have used ChatGPT or the other similar tools may know that sometimes they use a thinking model, which processes things more before answering. Those do use more energy. Estimates are it's roughly 10 times as large than the ChatGPT 4o numbers. So it's about 33 watt-hours, or 10 times as large as the larger estimate. If you watch 1 hour of Netflix, that's the equivalent of 30 ChatGPT 03 queries or recently model queries. So, which in most cases, you're probably not going to use anywhere near that number over the course of a day. So thinking about how much energy is being used by ChatGPT versus other things in your life, it's probably going to be pretty small. The other big concern that I typically hear from folks, which also came up in the chat, is water usage. Some of you may have seen a stat going around about every time you use ChatGPT, you're using 500 milliliters of water. That stat is actually just incorrect. It was pulled from a study that found that amount of water was used for between 20 and 50 ChatGPT prompts. So again, if you're using 20 to 50 ChatGPT prompts a day, you may use 500 milliliters of water. But again, context is critical here. How much water usage is average? If you're someone who eats meat, maybe not all of you are, to produce a single hamburger, you use 660 gallons of water. So that's the equivalent of roughly 200,000 ChatGPT queries. So again, probably like the amount of water that's being used by an individual's usage of ChatGPT is likely to be a tiny percentage of their overall water usage through a day. If you don't eat meat, there's other things. Again, If you watch 1 hour of TV at home, that's roughly 4 gallons, which is going to be equivalent to 1,200 ChatGPT queries. So relative to other things, if you look at it on its own, it can seem large. Relative to other things, not so much. So that's all about ChatGPT and similar tools. What about AI beyond that? AI does use a lot of energy, and that amount of energy is growing. Estimates are that by 2030, AI computation is going to make up roughly 20% of all data center power usage. At that point, data centers will use 20% of the world's energy. If you look at just the AI component, that's going to be roughly 4% of the world's energy. So it's a very real portion. When we say AI usage, what do we mean? The key point here is that the vast majority of AI processing isn't chatbots. It's not tools like ChatGPT or Gemini. It's actually different AI aspects of systems we use that we don't necessarily think about being AI. Things like recommender systems on YouTube or Netflix, enterprise analytics for large-scale software, search algorithms if you're using Google or probably Google, or other things that other technology out there. Those are all things that maybe now rely more and more on AI, and that's actually where the vast bulk of AI energy is going. And so even if we were to take away all of the chatbot usage overnight, that's only going to be probably around the 3% drop in AI energy usage. So basically, focusing on tools like ChatGPT, that's not where the key aspect of this actually is. In a minute, I'm going to talk more about what you might focus on instead. But before that, I do want to say a bit about what does AI look like as far as potential beneficial aspects of it from a climate change perspective. So AI can actually be a very powerful tool in reducing climate emissions by using it as basically kind of a predictor and regulator how different systems that use electricity operate. That can be true in the power generation space, it can be true in the transport space, it can be true in the food sector, where a lot of emissions, not directly CO2, but creating greenhouse gases are emitted. There was a research by the Climate Institute that estimated AI has the potential to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by somewhere between 3.2 and 5.4 billion tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalent gases by 2035. So that, and to put in context, that amount, that's more than the annual emissions of the entire European Union. It's also substantially more than the predicted emissions level of AI, somewhere between 3 and 15 times as large. If AI is properly deployed as a positive force for mitigating climate change, it can far more than make up for the emissions that might result from it. So what does this actually look like in practice? There's certainly more work going, but a few examples already exist in the world. You'll notice a lot of these actually come from Google. They've been at the forefront of thinking about a lot of this stuff. So their DeepMind, their AI lab, created a wind forecasting system that can be deployed on wind farms and effectively increase the power you get from the same amount of wind by somewhere around 20% by better integrating it with the larger electric grid. A company called Vertigris AI, which looks at how AI can be used for building energy management, was able to achieve around 19% energy savings in buildings through a smart AI system that regulated how it operated. Another Google project called Greenlight is used to optimize traffic signals. Measurements on that suggest it's reducing emissions at intersections by around 10%. Another Google tool in Google Maps, they use AI-powered eco-routing, which is estimated to have prevented over 2.4 million tons of CO2 emissions since it launched in 2021. That's the equivalent of removing 500,000 cars from the roads during that period. Finally, on a different front, there's been some early work on AI to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions from livestock, using it to design new forms of food. In a measured study, there was a reduction of around 8% of methane, which shows you in climate space, we know that it's a much more harmful greenhouse gas than CO2. And then broader research suggested that potentially that reduction could end up being as high as 80 to 98%. Given all that, what should we be doing? This session will be geared towards people who work in the climate space, but a lot should be relevant for individuals as well. The main takeaway is focus on the systemic over the individual for most climate change stuff, that it's really the overlying systems and corporations driving emissions where you're going to get more bang for your buck than individual choices. Push for clean energy usage in data centers, knowing that data centers are going to be 20% of global energy usage in 10 years. If a lot more of those run clean energy instead of using fossil fuels, that's going to make a big difference on the climate change front. And there already has been some work on that. Again, I'd say Google has been mostly at the forefront of like being transparent about how much of their different data centers are using renewable energy versus other sources. But I think there's definitely opportunity to push for both them and the other players to do better. So pushing for existing data centers to use more renewables. For new data centers construction, which a lot is in the works right now, push for it to be in areas with abundant renewable. Like if they're being developed in areas with easy access to solar or to wind energy, that's going to make a big difference in what sort of energy is powering these AI systems. If you're thinking about the actual AI usage front, focus primarily on the non-chatbot side of it, where you're getting the vast majority of energy usage. On the waterfront, while overall usage may not be massive for these, where you're pulling your water from does make a big difference. And there are cases where data centers have been set up in a way where it is sourcing it from water that is very disruptive to local ecosystem. So that is definitely, I think, an area that would make sense to push for more responsible approaches. And then I think a big thing is just overall transparency here. If you can get all these companies to be open about how they're setting up their data centers, where that energy is coming from, how they're sourcing water, it's going to be much easier to ensure that that's being done in a responsible way. But yeah, overall, as with anything on the climate front, this is a matter of cost and benefits. We don't want to let the enemy or the perfect be the enemy of the good. For those who have used it, you know that tools like ChatGPT can be very helpful at helping you to save time, to be more effective in your work. So folks at climate organizations, you're going to be more effective in your jobs if you can take advantage of these tools to do your advocacy work more efficiently. And if you do want to be looking for ways that you as an individual, your org can be reducing emissions, a better point of focus is other things that are using more energy in your life, thinking about wherever you work, how it's being powered, being more intentional about traveling, avoiding long flights when you can. If you want to, like focusing on your diet, thinking about obviously reducing meat consumption can make a big difference. Lots of things that if you want to focus on what you can immediately change will have a bigger impact than reducing your usage of AI tools. And then finally, as I said, these tools can be incredibly powerful for doing your work. Also think about how can you do more with less by taking advantage of that technology. And with that, that is the end of the presentation. Let me see if there's other comments here. That was not addressed yet.
Folks, please drop in questions for either of the presenters. Jim, I do have a question for you. I'm trying to fix a problem. I can ask ChatGPT how to fix it, or I can watch a 4-minute YouTube video. Equivalent?
YouTube is probably going to be like somewhere around 100 ChatGPT queries for the most part. Wow. So yeah.
I think that was my assumption. And I think that's super important, right? We're thinking about the worst case. And there are these places where it actually saves data processing in things that we are doing that we could do less of, right?
I think YouTube currently uses 3% of global energy.
Crazy.
To give you a sense of what streaming videos broadly is even more than that. Just putting things in context, something that we do in our daily lives we don't necessarily even pause to think about from an energy perspective is quite significant compared to a lot of other things.
Someone saying that they don't understand the water analogies, the hamburger and the 600. Do you want to pull that slide back up as you're explaining it? I think it's helpful.
I can tell you it is basically the process for raising cattle. To get 1 pound of beef from cattle, you have to feed the cattle, it's some crazy number, like 100 pounds of feed. And then the amount of water used to create that feed is just very, very high. So that is where that very large number comes from.
Yeah. And I think this one's super helpful, just like when we're talking about the water usage too, right? Because it would be same with I'm just trying to get an answer to fix a thing. the YouTube video versus the chat GPT answer, right? I may do one query or two, right? Like I may ask it 3 or 4 questions to figure out how I finish wiring this thing. And the YouTube video, I watch 4 or 5 minutes, way more water usage, right?
The energy usage seem to go along pretty closely, certainly on the data center front, which again, YouTube is being powered by data centers, just like any AI is.
Yeah.
I realize you missed Kate's had a concern about land use and noise pollution from data centers. I don't have hard data around what exactly it looks like, but I think if you're thinking about data centers as an advocacy point of focus, that certainly can be part of it as well. Like as there is proposals for new data centers to be created, to actually have people with local knowledge be able to say, okay, what does this mean for our community? And push for it to be done in a way that it's responsible and is not putting externalities on the people who are living there.
Because it is real. Data centers are, right, impacting Black and brown communities in the United States way more than other communities. While the data being consumed by AI is going to increase, they're also just getting built for you to use Amazon and use to book your airline ticket and whatever. And I think there are bigger structural conversations about advocacy to stop it where it's hurting communities, taking water resources where there isn't water or doing it in
Right.
ways that are hurting those communities. In a sense, AI became a slick boogeyman because there are some shitty people running some of these AI companies, right? Like that, we know that, right? Also, some awful people running the car industry and the oil industry, right? And so, it's how do folks think about the effective advocacy and pushing back on the data centers where they are essentially cruel and purely extractive to a community, right? And I think that's a really important
Yeah.
part of it.
Yeah, definitely. Paula had a put in the chat, just looking at the cumulative impact. If you think about all the different billions of queries that are happening on a day, like you're talking about millions of gallons of water, that is true. And I think it's just a question of context here. I don't have the number, but I can guarantee you that is a tiny fraction compared to water usage for daily beef consumption. So, which is not to say like, let's not look for ways for it to be better, which again, I think that's where, like, if you look at data centers as the point of focus, like pushing them. And I think there's actually different technologies in data center for water usage that can be greater or lesser. So I do think that is the point of focus where you can look at ways of being more efficient. But what I've seen people do, which I think is a big mistake, is to say, these tools are doing bad things to the environment, so I don't want to engage with them. Which I think you both, by not engaging with them, you sometimes misunderstanding how it's happening and how you can effectively advocate, and you don't then have an opportunity to see how can this be a valuable tool in allowing me to be more effective in my work. So I think, again, context is key. Thinking about, okay, what does this mean? How can we change it? But not just saying that me opting out is going to actually lead to better outcomes here from an environmental perspective.
I think there's another perspective going back to the Black and brown communities. We don't really have the joy of not eating hamburgers a lot of the time. Like that's the food that people can eat. Some people don't have internet, and so it's like, yes, use it and try not to eat beef, but I don't think that's realistic for a lot of Americans. So yeah, I agree that we should be thinking about other ways to beat climate change, but to not have those effects on the environment.
Yeah, I don't know, Jim. I also seems to me like I assume hamburger is used for shorthand as a thing that like the majority of Americans eat. Is that the
I think it is. Beef uses a shocking amount of water. When you see that ratio, it is extremely high. So I think that's why it can be a good context setting comparison point. But you're right that for people out there who aren't eating hamburgers, yeah, probably good to have another. I mean, they had the TV example there that if watching an hour TV is like 1,200 ChatGPT queries
yeah.
from a
I mean,
water perspective.
and hamburgers is easier to understand, I get it.
I may be wrong, but I'm guessing those of you who are like, I'm good, I'm eating the Beyond Burger, it's probably still more than the hour of TV. It's probably at least 4, 5, or 6 times higher than that, right? So no one's getting an easy pass on your food consumption in an industrial country. That's not how that works.
I'm glad I don't eat beef. I'll rather watch TV. So I'm doing my part.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to me there's a incredibly complicated intersection to this in like it feels intersectional in like so like a myriad of layered ways in that like if you're a nonprofit or a group doing advocacy, your budgets have probably been decimated over the last 3 years. A lot of folks have struggled to raise money post-pandemic for a number of reasons. And then like wealthy people thought there was something was going to happen early in the year and they stopped giving money and the government stopped giving grants. That all snowballed. It doesn't seem like wealthy philanthropy has come back, even though they're all still doing fine, as always. It's like I think AI presents a benefit in verging on dystopian times, and the structural inequities in the United States means that the data centers are doing harms in the same way refineries and factories have done harms, right? And a lot of folks want to like skip over that, and to me, it seems like some folks are, I understand the like say no at large because of potential data center impacts and how AI is impacting jobs, but saying no also doesn't make the organization doing the work better or more efficient in the headwinds of the whole extractive system coming harder on people. And so to me, that feels like why my general stance is I really think you should be using it. Even if you're working in the campaign to advocate to stop or make data centers that are less brutal, it will also help you make that campaign better, right? Don't kneecap yourself against a structure that is beyond David and Goliath. It is a large, cruel, racist, extractive system that we live in. I think it's a lot to balance for folks, but that's my take. When folks are like, I'm just not going to use it, I'm not going to go advocate for these extractive companies further, but that's my take on it.
And I think when you're talking about setting up a refinery somewhere, the people setting up a refinery, they're probably not going to listen when you raise environmental concerns because if they're running a refinery, they already have shown they don't really care about that much.
Yeah.
Whereas with some tech companies, there are people like in leadership and certainly on staff of these companies where they do feel more passionately about making sure it's not making things worse on the climate change front. So I think there are opportunities for corporate campaigning around things like data centers that may not be nearly as true for some traditional industrial setups that, to your point, Brad, I think can be very analogous as far as the process that is currently being pursued. I really do feel like there's a big opportunity here to shape how a lot of this is done if progressive organizations, activists can get ahead of it and thinking about how to put pressure where it can make a difference.
Yeah. It was just making me, it is complicated in that all of these big companies are complicated webs of humans, right? Some of the companies, I'm kind of thinking of Google, for instance, they have certainly dropped their do no evil thing. I think they have probably dropped DEI in name, but they're still actually doing a lot of that work. They have more explicit climate and community impacts in the way they're operating. They do have people who, while they may not be fully progressive, they are somewhere in the spectrum that you could put pressure and get them to make better choices that impact communities, potentially have a non-net negative impact on communities.
And on that note, Google actually put out a free online course of how to, if you're doing AI work, be more carbon aware and use more renewables in your setup of those systems. So it is something the organization has actually devoted resources to. Again, how that's balancing against overall profit priorities may take a backseat to that in almost every case, but there is some degree, at least, a public commitment to still care about this stuff.
And they have a responsible AI division at Google as well. And I think Microsoft might too. So at least there's somebody focused on it at those companies.
Yeah, I think they are. My thought is it's not pure bullshit. It's not greenwashing. There are people who actually care. I just shared what I think is the course you were talking about
Yeah.
to the chat. Do folks have any other questions or thoughts? I know a lot of folks are thinking about this on the bias front and the climate front and the inherent intersectionality of both. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. We definitely make sure we share. I know, Jim, if you want to throw in your LinkedIn as well, but I'll share it out with the recording for folks too. And we will make sure that folks have the slides from the sessions. I appreciate you both showing up, and we'll definitely keep having these conversations, 'cause I think they're absolutely critical to the work that we're doing. So thank you both.
Of course. Have a good
Thanks for organizing that, and thank you, Catherine.